in the UK. Alex has already mentioned energy crops. Now, to be careful here, when we say energy crops for anaerobic digestion, what we're talking about is farmed energy crops, typically maize, therefore maize silage, grass silage, and fodder beet. So we're talking about crops which a farmer would be growing in the normal circumstances. Those are the sorts of energy crops we're talking about for anaerobic digestion. I will go on to talk about food waste, which we've already heard about today, very important potential feedstock for anaerobic digestion, and sewage sludge, mustn't forget sewage sludge, as well as things like fats and oils, industrial sludges and the like. So those, broadly speaking, are the types of feedstock which are available for anaerobic digestion. As you can see, they're very widespread and they happen in very different circumstances, but I absolutely live with what John Gummer has said. First, we must minimise. It's the same with waste management, it's the same with energy management. First we minimise, then we see what we can do with what's left over. So the second part of our diagram is the biogas. What is biogas? Biogas is approximately 60% methane with the balance being carbon dioxide. That balance of methane to carbon dioxide actually depends upon the feedstock. In other words, you're putting pig slurry into an anaerobic digester, you will get a methane content in excess of 60%. If you're putting maize silage in, it'll be nearer to 50%. It's simply a matter of the chemistry, if you like. So having a high methane content isn't necessarily a sign of a good operating digester. Now, what can you do with biogas? Broadly speaking, you can do three things with biogas. You can use it for cooking, for example, but broadly speaking, what you can do is you can put it into a boiler to produce hot water or steam through a boiler. And if you do so, you do it with a thermodynamic efficiency of about 85%. In other words, 15% of the fuel value going into that boiler is lost. The most common use of biogas within Europe, certainly Western Europe, is to take the biogas into a combined heat and power unit, a CHP. What that generally comprises is a spark ignition engine driving a generator, and with full heat recovery from the engine in the form of the jacket water heat, the oil cooling, and also the exhaust gases. You can see from this slide here that we actually can generate electricity and heat from a CHP with the same overall thermodynamic efficiency as we do from the boiler. In other words, we have about 15% losses, where you might be producing 40% of the fuel going into the engine is electricity, and 45% is heat. Where this is relevant is if you remember from the first slide that anaerobic digestion actually requires heat itself. It requires heat to keep it at elevated temperature, and if you're taking in materials like food waste or other animal byproducts, you have to have a pasteurization process, which is operating at a temperature of 70 degrees centigrade, and therefore you need heat for that, so that within the anaerobic digestion process and pasteurization there is a heat requirement. So if you're running your biogas into an engine, you actually use the engine heat for your process heat rather than have to actually burn biogas directly for that. So coupling a CHP unit to a biogas plant is a very sensible approach. However, even in that case, in very often case studies with anaerobic digestion and CHP, there's a large amount of surplus heat beyond that which the process requires. And that's a big challenge. Because unlike with other types of renewable heat processes, the heat from anaerobic digestion is produced continuously. You cannot match easily the supply of that heat with the demand for that heat. And that's for the industry, and coming through with a renewable heat incentive coming through, that again is a real challenge for us as to how we can actually develop methods of using the valuable renewable heat. Now generally the third thing you can do with biogas is you can upgrade it by removing the carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and to dry it to produce what we call biomethane. Now, importantly, the definition of biomethane is that it is pipeline quality gas which comes from a recent biological source. In other words, it doesn't come from a biological source which is 5 million years old, it's today's biological source. The other thing we need to remember about biomethane is you can produce biomethane through anaerobic digestion, but you can also produce biomethane from gasification. You can produce syngas from gasification of wood, for example. Having therefore produced that syngas, you can upgrade that to biomethane. So there are actually two sources to biomethane, i.e. to pipeline quality gas, renewable gas, through anaerobic digestion and through gasification. And about 2 years ago, the National Grid published a report on the potential for renewable gas, for biomethane, and they came up with a startling conclusion. I was startled by it when I saw the numbers, was that we could, if we produce biomethane from every possible source of biomass in the UK, then we could produce 50% of our domestic gas consumption. 50% of it. But obviously we're not going to ever get that far, and perhaps leading on from what John Gummer was saying, if we reduced our energy consumption by 50%, then it would be 100%. So these are big figures. It's showing the importance both of anaerobic digestion and of gasification within the context of pipeline gas. The biofertilizer. If we look at the biomass which is going into an anaerobic digestion plant and look at the key elements there, there's the nitrogen, phosphate and potash, so the NPK, as well as the carbon. We're taking that into anaerobic digestion, which is then a closed process. You're producing methane and carbon dioxide, that's only CH4 and CO2. This means that all the nitrogen, phosphate and potash, which was actually in your original biomass, ends up in your biofertilizer. And importantly, particularly when we talk about food waste and animal manure, is that you are making that nitrogen very much more available as a plant nutrient. The nitrogen in the biomass with food waste and manure is tied up in proteins and carbohydrates and fats, very complex, which plants cannot get a hold of. So if you put it from an anaerobic digestion plant, you're producing ammonium compounds, which are very, very readily available as a fertilizer. So what the anaerobic digestion process is doing for manure digestion and for food waste digestion is giving you a readily available source of renewable biofertilizer. And if we look at the carbon within this as well, yes, we convert a lot of the carbon into biogas, and your conversion ratio to biogas varies according to your feedstock, how easily digestible it is. But we shouldn't be too concerned about the carbon which ends up in the biofertilizer, because that carbon which we don't convert to biogas is also got a useful role as soil conditioner. So that is going with the biofertilizer into the soil to help build up soil structure. So this is why, for me, anaerobic digestion, as it has been for the last 36 years, is a must process. But it's not, again, leading on from John Gummer's comments, it's not the only must process, it's one of the must processes. Why is it happening now? Why are we talking about anaerobic digestion? Why have we been doing it for the last 5 years in particular? I mean, I've been trying to rattle government's doors for the last 15 years to get them to understand what it means and what we mean by anaerobic digestion. As the climate change debate accelerated, and the whole issue of anaerobic digestion then became very interesting, because anaerobic digestion actually contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in 4 ways. The 2 I really want to emphasise here are, number 1 is in preventing the uncontrolled emissions of methane to atmosphere, methane being 21 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And secondly, back to this biofertilizer. Those farmers who are using mineral fertilizer on their land and have been doing for many, many years, that mineral fertilizer comes from factories which are using fossil fuels to produce that nitrogen in particular. And the production of 1 tonne of nitrogen results in the emissions of more than 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So by capturing this resource, this material as food waste or manure, and making it into a valuable biofertilizer, we are displacing nitrogen. And yes, we can reduce transport of waste by doing local schemes, and yes, obviously we produce renewable energy. Now here I come to a paradox, which has been about my issue with government for so long. Is that because the paradox is that anaerobic digestion is almost too good to be true. And that means that government, bless them, have found it very difficult to understand what it is. If you put a stick in the air, and you put a propeller on top of the stick, and the wind blows, the propeller goes around, and you make electricity. Conceptually, that's very easy to understand. But anaerobic digestion it's a waste management process, it's a nutrient management process, and it's a renewable energy process. That means we need government to get together, the demands of government to get together to really understand what this process can do for us in the UK, whether it be from an industrial side or actually from all the stakeholders that John Gummer was talking about earlier on. I've found it completely frustrating that government does not seem to grasp that a complex process can produce so many different benefits. And it's interesting, if we look at the local environment and all the benefits there, we've heard about them already, but particularly here upon reducing the dependence on artificial fertilisers and producing local energy, my prediction today is that within 10 years, the climate change debate will have been overtaken. and it will have been overtaken by the resource management debate. That what we should be looking at here is the production of local energy in the UK, and we should be talking about the maintenance of our resource, i.e. that biofertiliser. And that is where the debate is going to lead us to. And I'm looking forward to that happening. I also say about the climate change debate, that the climate change actually may give us the right answer to the wrong question. In other words, all the technologies that climate change debate is bringing forward are actually technology we need for our resource management and energy security. There are two which don't apply to the climate change debate, to me, which we should look very carefully about. One is carbon sequestration, and the other one is nuclear power. And obviously the debate of nuclear power will move on after the tragic events of the last week. So we've got the global environment, we've got the local environment. What I want to do now is just sort of whip around the world and just sort of show you examples of anaerobic digestion. And as I show you these slides, I want to think about the different drivers that have instigated these particular projects. And I'll start off at the very simplest level. Here we have a household digester in India, where this lady is using feedstocks from her garden, from her food waste, cattle manure, night soil, etc., to go into a little anaerobic digestion plant there to produce biogas. And you see the little green pipe going into the house there. That's the pipe carrying the biogas. And what it is doing in the house is she is using that biogas for cooking. And that gives her two distinct advantages. One is that the atmosphere in her kitchen is much cleaner because she's no longer burning wood in her kitchen for her cooking. And so that there's no particulate emissions, etc. So that's a big one. Secondly, she does not have to go out and collect wood fuel. They say that in India, 70% of the work is done by women. And I mentioned this to a delegation of Indians the other day who happened to be all male, and they looked rather shocked when I told them that. But much of the women's work in India is about collecting firewood. And if you look across Asia now, and John Gummer again mentioned China, in China, 20 million households cook on biogas. 20 million. In the UK, I think there are 5, of which I'm proud to say that I'm one. Not 5 million, one. 5 households in the whole of the UK cooking on biogas. This slide here shows how simple anaerobic digestion can be. Look at the water industry. Here's an example of a sewage sludge digester. I think Alex has already showed a similar slide to this already this morning. Sewage sludge. The reason I'm showing this slide here is to demonstrate to you that anaerobic digestion is not new. Anaerobic digestion has been with us for very many years, particularly in the water industry, where sewage sludge is processed to reduce odours, to reduce volume, to produce energy, and also to produce material for farmland. Now, just remember this date. The first sewage sludge digestion plant was built in the UK back in 1895. 1895, it was built in Exeter, for treating the sewage from the city of Exeter, and the biogas from that was actually used to light the streets of Exeter using gas lamps. So it actually shows you another example of the way that biogas can be so versatile. If we now look at what's been happening in Denmark for the past 15 years, Denmark really pioneered what we call the central anaerobic digestion plant, the CAD plant. And here we have an example of an area where Denmark is very much ahead of the UK. Ahead of the UK in two particular ways. Slightly controversial maybe with this audience. Firstly, they have a culture in Denmark of farmer cooperation. And secondly, they have a culture in Denmark of district heating. So here we have a centralised plant in Denmark, which was built 15 years ago, where a group of farmers have got together, raised the funds, built a biogas plant, to which they bring all their manure, their slurries, to that biogas plant. They also bring to that biogas plant industrial sludges and fish processing waste, for which they get a gate fee income for that. So they co-digest the manure with the industrial sludges. They pasteurise because they have to. They need to, and that is obviously supported. They pasteurise in order that they can then send back to their own farms a biosecure biofertiliser for displacing mineral fertiliser needs. And on this plant here, the biogas is used in a combined heat and power unit in that big red box. The chap's not quite as grumpy as he looks in the photograph. He's a very happy chap. He'd been running this plant for 10 years when I saw him. And in that red box is our CHP unit. So there's a gas engine, a spark ignition engine driving a generator to produce electricity. About 5% of that electricity is used within the biogas plant itself, and the balance is exported to the grid. Importantly, though, which is where this is different,